All right, guys. Today is January 21st, 2021, 1/21/21. We completed the exam from yesterday. Um, RT210 C, which is pulmonary. It was pulmonary A and B. And now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what you do as a therapist, okay? Knowing what those volumes. Now we're going to talk about those volumes that go in and out of the lungs with normal breathing, through deep breathing. How much is it? What is it classified as? I've been telling you guys that normal in and out, quiet breathing is called what? What did I say that's called? Just the volume that goes in and out of the lungs. That I'm talking about the volume itself. That volume that goes in and out of the lungs during normal quiet breathing is called what?
Is it tidal volume?
Tidal volume. Good. Tidal volume is the classification of the volume that goes in and out of the lungs during quiet breathing. Okay, it's called tidal volume. Now today you're going to, or maybe not. I don't know if it's per se today, but during this lesson, you guys are going to learn 3 more volumes that are classified in our lungs, as well as 4 capacities of the lungs. We're going to learn compliance. So you write this down. Compliance is very, very important as it pertains to the mechanics of the lungs. Compliance. Compliance is the ability of the lung to do what you want it to do. Okay. If you try to give some volume to a patient and the lungs just won't open, right? Then that lung has a low compliance. Okay. Just think of somebody who's supposed to take medicine every day. If they don't take the medicine, they're known to be compliant. Okay, they're not compliant. When you have a child or something that you're telling the child what to do, younger brother or sister or whatever, and they won't do it, they hard-headed, that means they have a low compliance. They will not do what you want them to do. Okay, now lungs that will do what you want them to do but are just like super easy to get along with, those are saying to have high compliance. Okay, they have a high compliance. So again, compliance is the ability for the lung to distend, right? For the ability of it to stretch and open up. That's compliance. Everybody's compliance is a little bit different, right? But from what you learned yesterday, what do you think is a very important component of compliance from what you learned about the lungs in this last lesson? What have you learned that may affect the patient's compliance? Something that the lungs do or produce that allow the lungs to do what they're supposed to do.
If it's full with mucus, in the lungs, it won't expand because it has so much fluid in the lungs.
And no, not the mucus. You're close, but not mucus. Mucus is just a byproduct. It doesn't.
Surfactant.
Surfactant. There you go. Surfactant, because we said surfactant reduces the surface tension, right? And that allows those lungs to open up. Remember, we said some babies are born before their type 2 cells, right, are fully mature. And the type 2 cells produce what? Surfactant. So if the type 2 cells, if the baby's born before those cells are fully mature, then the baby's lungs are going to be stiff. Okay, that's why they come out. They can't breathe because their lungs have a low compliance because they just won't do what you want them to do. Okay, and the reason why they won't distend is because they have a low compliance, it's because the surfactant level is too low. Okay, so that's why we have to introduce some surfactant down the baby's ET tube and bag the little fluid into them, and then eventually those lungs will start to be malleable and distend like you want them to. So we have to add surfactant to babies who were born before the type 2 cells are fully developed. And those type 2 cells are called what? Clara cells, excellent. The Clara cells, okay? So now we want to be taught, that's why I told you have to be able to use what you've learned to put it toward what you're learning now, okay? You have all of it comes together, okay? It all comes together. So knowing that, there are some diseases that you want to learn that have a telltale sign, right? If you have certain diseases like COPD patients have a high compliance. They have a high compliance because with a COPD, that is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That's what COPD stands for, okay? It's also nicknamed floppy lungs. Floppy lungs. The lungs have lost their elasticity, okay? When you inhale, the lungs open up, and then when you exhale, you just let go and they come back together because of elasticity. But if you have smoked away the elastic fibers in the lungs, they become flaccid and they're not able to exhale like you and I can exhale. So their compliance is high because they just floppy, like lungs, and don't think anything by it, but a scrotum, okay? A male scrotum, that's how lungs are in COPD patients. They're kind of just flaccid, like the meat on the back of your elbow, right? They're just kind of flaccid. They have lost their elasticity. I always joke and say it's like old drawers. Anybody who has an old pair of underwear in the drawer that's old, you hold it up, it has no elastic in the band, it's just open, right? That would be a very, very high compliance because you can stretch them as much as you want and they don't come back, right? They have a high compliance. Question? No, they don't need surfactant because they're open, right? They have a high compliance, so they don't need any extra surfactant. Yes. The detergent-like phospholipid produced by the type 2 cells is surfactant. And what that does is make the lungs malleable, right? But a COPD is already malleable. He has smoked away all of his elastic fibers. So now when he inhales, he tries to exhale, he can't get the air out, okay? COPDers cannot get the air out. Write that down. COPDers, which is an obstructive disease because COPD stands for chronic obstructive respiratory disease. Those type of patients cannot fully exhale. Okay, they can't fully exhale. Like me and you, we can inhale and let all of that back out. But the COPDers, those smokers, cannot fully exhale. All right. So therefore, they're going to have higher volumes left in the lungs. And not only that, what do you suspect? Give me a term. Give me a term that you expect to see in this patient because of COPD. Sometimes they do use that. Sometimes they do use some accessory muscles. But I'm looking for, and as a response to the air getting in and out. Since the air...
Hypercapnia.
What you say?
Hypercapnia.
Hypercapnia. Good. Because we exhale CO2, and if you can't get the CO2 out, you're going to be building up CO2, right? So COPD patients are always hypercapnic, always, which means they're always a little bit acidotic, right? Their ABG and their blood work will always be a little acidotic because they can't get the air out. And the air that we exhale is CO2, right? And CO2 is an acid and it pertains to ventilation. So if they can't fully ventilate, then their CO2 levels will start to climb. And over time, it's just always high. Okay, they're always hypercapnic.
So how do you fix COPD?
You fix people. We're going to talk about that when we get to that. But the damage, when the damage is done, it's done. You can't reverse COPD. So that's why we tell you, if you're smoking, stop now. No, the lungs, once the lungs have, when you damage lungs like brain cells, when the lung cells are damaged, it's irreversible. Now, the symptoms can be alleviated, right? I might, like if you were smoking and you were short of breath all the time and all of that, stop smoking, like the blood pressure was up, all those kind of things that come from smoking. If you stop smoking, your blood pressure may go back down and your appetite will change. You may be able to breathe a little bit easier. You feel a little better, but the damage to the lungs is done. Okay? It's not reversible. All right? It's not reversible.
So is it true to say that hypoventilation causes hypercapnia?
Yes.
Or is that the same thing? Oh,
That's right. Hypoventilation causes hypercapnia or carbia, right? If you don't breathe it off, it's going to build up. So that's what we were doing the other day when I was doing that. Hyperventilation causes hypocapnia, and hypoventilation causes hypercapnia, right? Because capnia is CO2. If you're barely blowing it off, it's going to build up. If you're blowing off too much, it's going to be too low. Okay? So that's why we're talking about this today, because we're going to talk about the pulmonary mechanics. And so you will know what levels are normal and what levels show us disease process. So this thing back here called the spirogram is one of the pulmonary function tests that we can do to determine the severity of somebody's respiratory disease, okay? Whether they have a restriction or an obstruction, okay? Now, highlight this right quick. In an obstruction, you can't get the air out. In an obstruction means you can't get the air fully out. And if it is a restrictive disease, you can't get the air in. If it is a restrictive disease, then the patient cannot get the air in. And that would be, you want to learn from somebody who has muscular dystrophy, scoliosis, kyphoscoliosis, Pectus Excavatum, where the body is contorted. And if the body is contorted, then the lungs can't ventilate. They can't really expand, right? So they can't get the air in. That is a restrictive disease. When we get to RT210J, you want to learn all of the restrictive diseases and all of the obstructive diseases. And you need to know the difference between them. And like I said, this is just one of the pulmonary function tests that we can do to determine, hey, this person is air trapping. This person is has a higher volumes than he should. That means he can't get it out. Oh, he must have COPD. Okay? Those many ways to determine or diagnose these diseases. Okay? Now, so let's look at some of the notes. Now, what I just said was, if you have an obstruction, you can't get the air out, which means you will start to build CO2, right, and be hypercapnic. Okay? Now, I said that COPDers have a very high compliance, right? Because I can blow them lungs open, but they just won't close. But as far as me making them go open, oh, they'll go open all day long. They're floppy. They just they'll open right on up for me, like old draws. They're just wide open, right? But they won't exhale well. So they have a high compliance. So COPD equals a high compliance. Make sure you are able to compare that. COPDers have a high compliance. COPDers have a high compliance. Okay? Because as we go on, we're going to learn, okay, well, if COPDers have a high compliance, right? And then high compliance means a high FRC. Well, then that means COPDers will have a high FRC. Okay? That's the that we know if apples is this and this is this, you know how you used to do. So we'll get to that, but I want you, the first step is COPDers have a high compliance. Okay? COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. All right. Some of the objectives quickly. You will be able to calculate static and dynamic compliance because there's different types of compliance. We have static compliance and we have dynamic compliance. You're going to be able to discuss the changes in compliance, right? Because when you're getting somebody on a ventilator, when you're in a hospital, you have ways to test their plateau pressures, which will be indicative of their compliance. And then I can say, hey, his compliance is getting better or his compliance is getting worse, right? That's things you can look at to see is the lung condition improving or is the lung condition getting worse, all right? You're going to be able to talk about the changes in resistance. Changes in resistance. That's going to talk about the flow through a tube, right? An airway. As air flows through the airway, it builds up resistance. And you're going to talk about that. Describe the series of events in ventilation. Now, differentiate between ventilation and respiration. We did that the other day. We said ventilation is simply moving air in and out the lungs. But respiration is the actual what?
The gas exchange.
Gas exchange. Thank you. Gas exchange. That's respiration. Gas exchange. Now, gas exchange between the lungs and outside is called what? What type of respiration?
External.
External. Gas exchange between the lungs and outside. That is external respiration. And then gas exchange at the tissue level is called internal respiration. All right. A lot of people miss that on the test. All right. Then you will be able to talk about two gentlemen's laws. Poiseuille's. You're going to be able to recall the difference between Poiseuille's law and Laplace law, right? And then talk about how important they are. Who remembers what Laplace's law? You might not remember, but I talked about it. I wonder who remembers. What was that talking about? The law of Laplace. Does anybody remember the law of Laplace that I was talking about?
Does it have to do with the surface tension of the alveoli, something like that?
So what example did I use when I was talking about the surface tension between the alveoli? What example did I use?
You used a raindrop.
Raindrops. Good. I said if you have a little bitty raindrop coming down the window and it's on its way to touch a large raindrop, when that little one touches, the large one's going to suck it in, right? Because the larger raindrop has a higher surface tension, right? And that was what would happen in the lungs as well. One large alveoli would pop or collapse a small one if they were to touch through collateral ventilation, right? But because of surfactant that is made, it equals the playing field. So now the large alveoli has the same surface tension as the small one. Therefore, they're able to coexist without the larger one collapsing the smaller. Okay? All right. Make sure y'all studying and reading and putting this stuff together. It's building on. So you're going to talk about Poiseuille and you're going to talk about Laplace. Now, Number 7, draw the spirogram. That's what I have on the board back here. This is one example of the spirogram. And you're going to have to be able, you need to be able to do that, because when you do that, guys, that's going to really help you in your testing. Because when you clear your desk and I give you your blank sheet of paper, you can write this. Once you memorize it, you can write it down. Because I may ask you, IRV plus VT equals what? If you got it wrote down, you'll say, oh, that's IC. Those two together equal IC, okay? Or if I say IC subtract IRV leaves me with VT, right? You're going to have worksheets that do that, all right? So you're going to have to memorize these volumes and capacities. You have 4 volumes and 4 capacities, and they have a definition and they have a value of how much it is. Okay, we already said that tidal volume is about 500 cc's, right? Or 0.5 liters. We know that one, but you're going to have to know the rest of them. All right. So what? Volume sheet. In the module? Oh, okay, probably so. Yeah, we're going to talk about all those things too. Those are different formulas we got to learn. All right, number 9. Describe each volume or capacity as a function of inspiration and expiration. So that is kind of like the definition, for example, guys, the definition of tidal volume. The definition, let me get my stick. The definition of tidal volume, VT, is the amount of air that is moved during normal, quiet breathing. See? Normal in, normal out. 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 That's tidal volume. That's what you're doing right now. Tidal volume. And that amount of gas that's moving in and out is about 500 cc's, which is 0.5 liters. So the difference between 2.4 and 3.1 is 0.5. Okay, that's what that's showing you there. But like I said, we'll get into the spirogram a little bit in a minute. I'm not expecting to memorize it this second, but I'm going over the objectives so you can see what I'm talking about. All right. Then you will need to discuss the relationship between the FRC, which is functional residual capacity, and compliance. Remember, they are directly related. FRC and compliance are directly related. If you have a high compliance, then you will have a high FRC. If you have a low compliance, you'll have a low FRC. They are directly related. When I say directly, that means if one goes one way, the other one goes the same way. When I say inversely related, that means they're opposite. Okay? But FRC and compliance are directly related. All right. Number 11, you're going to have to learn how to calculate minute ventilation and alveolar minute ventilation. Now, this is simply saying how much of that gas came in and out of the lungs in 1 minute. Okay? How much of that gas came out in 1 minute. So that's when we have to multiply the volume by the frequency. Okay? Frequency is how many times you breathe in a minute, right? Normal respiratory rate is 12 to 20 breaths per minute, right? And so that's going to be a formula that you're going to learn. Very simple. Once you get it, you got it. All right, you're going to have to describe dead space and the normal values. Dead space, guys, is any of the gas that's in the conducting zones. Any gas that's not participating in the magic. It's just wasted ventilation. It's just wasted. All of the gas is in your trachea right now. All of the gas is in your left and right mainstem bronchus. The gas that's sitting in your bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, all of that is just simply wasted ventilation, or also known as dead space. because it's not participating in the magic. The magic happens at the respiratory bronchioles, right? And the alveoli. That's where the magic is happening, okay? So dead space is all of that volume that's not participating in gas exchange. You want to learn how to calculate that based on the patient's weight and height. All right. Describe the equipment used to measure the tidal volume and minute ventilation. Describe eucapnia. What would eucapnia be? What does eucapnia mean? Not normal breathing. That's eupnea. Eupnea is normal breathing. What would eucapnia be? Huh?
Normal CO2.
Normal CO2. Normal CO2 is eucapnia. So you're going to have to describe eucapnia, eucapnia ventilation, hypoventilation, and hyperventilation in view of alveolar ventilation and dead space. So we said eucapnia ventilation was normal CO2, right? So what number, does anybody remember what number of CO2 would be eucapnia? 35 to 45 what? Millimeters of mercury. So any CO2 that is between 35 and 45 millimeters of mercury is eucapnia ventilation, normal CO2. What about hypoventilation? What numbers would I see in hypoventilation? Above 45. Good. Any CO2 that's greater than 45. Excellent. What about hyperventilation? What kind of CO2 would I see during hyperventilation?
Less than 35.
Good. Less than 35. Okay. All right. All right. Then we're going to talk about the normal unit, the dead space, and then we're talking about alveoli. Alveoli are described as units. Either it's a normal unit, it's a dead space unit, it's shunting unit, or silent unit. Okay, and that's in terms of perfusion and ventilation. Because we said that in the alveoli, it should be some magic happening, right? But not necessarily. If the alveoli is closed, ain't no magic happening, right? Or if there's no blood touching the alveoli. What if there's no blood flow to that particular alveoli? Can gas exchange? Yeah, that when you have, shunt is when you have the blood, but you don't have the alveoli. That's a shunt. Okay, but when you have the alveoli open, but there is no blood coming, can gas exchange? No. If I have an alveoli that's sitting there wide open, full of oxygen, but there is no capillary blood flow, then gas can't exchange, right? That gas inside there has been wasted. That will be a dead space unit, right? That will be a dead space alveolar unit because there's no blood to come pick up the magic. I sucked in all this oxygen, but you didn't come get it, right? Or if you have plenty of blood flow to an alveoli, but the alveoli is closed, can gas exchange happen? No, it can't happen because the alveoli is not open. It doesn't have any oxygen in it. So the blood came and left without picking up oxygen. That's a shunt. So that would be a shunt unit. All right. And you're going to learn that a silent unit, guys, is when you have no blood flow and no ventilation. So no blood or ventilation going to that unit. That's a silent unit. Okay. All right. I'm going to go over these 20, then we're going to take a break. Explain the RQ, which is respiratory quotient, and the normal value of it. Describe the regional differences of the ventilation to perfusion, both reclining and sitting. Now, VQ is ventilation to perfusion, okay? VQ ratio is the ventilation to perfusion ratio, right? We want them to be pretty close, so we have normal unit. A normal unit will have a nice amount of ventilation and a nice amount of perfusion. Perfusion means blood flow, okay? But sometimes you don't have that. You have a VQ mismatch. One of them is way greater than the other or without the other. And that's when we start talking about those units, Okay. All right, number 18, differentiate between shunting and dead space. We just did that. Discuss the causes of shunting in dead space. And finally, describe the types of dead space and 4 types of shunting. There's 4 types of dead space. There's 4 types of shunts. Okay, so again, it's a lot of information, guys, and it all boils down to what you've learned. You got to be able to bring back what you've learned. You got to understand that the pulmonary circulation starts on the right, and takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. If you don't have that down pat, there's no way you can continue. That's why I say you have to go back and study. A lot of people miss that when it said pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary circulation is on the right side. We said that's deoxygenated blood goes through the pulmonary artery into the lungs to pick up oxygen. All right? All right. Let's take a break. It's 1:40. Let's come back at 1:50 and we're going to get started. Come back at 1:50 and we're going to get started. Ventilation and respiration, 226, 227, 12th edition. Ventilation is what? It is the air movement. Kiara, mute your mic. The air movement in and out of the lungs to allow for external respiration to occur. So you need to understand that in order for respiration to occur, you have to first have ventilation. Okay? If I fill this room up, or I feel you, if you fill up your room wherever you are, let's just say, it can't be more than 100%, but just say if you could get 200, like my son says, Daddy, you love me 100, 200 million, 200, 100,000 million. If you fill up your room with 2 million% oxygen, you cannot do respiration if you don't ventilate. If you hold your breath, it can't do nothing for you, okay? The oxygen cannot get into the blood and exchange with the blood if you don't ventilate. So ventilation is the most important when you're dealing with a patient. Ventilation first, then oxygenation. Because if they don't ventilate, they can't oxygenate. All right? Now, respiration is the gas exchange. We talked about that. Across a permeable cellular membrane. Now, in the chat, it says respiration is gas exchange across a permeable cellular membrane. Now, I want you to tell me, what is the name of that membrane in respect to external respiration? Put it in the chat. Don't say it out loud. Put it in the chat. What would be the name of that permeable cellular membrane, or what would that membrane be made up of as it pertains to external respiration? Put it in the chat. Whoever iPhone is, you need to be a little more specific. You're on the right page. You're on the right track, but I need to be more specific. Whoever's labeled as iPhone. Oh, that's you? Oh, okay. Let me see if I can change your name. No.
Can you repeat the question again?
Okay, the question is, it says respiration is gas exchange across a permeable cellular membrane. Now, I want to know what would be that permeable cellular membrane, or what would it be made up of as respects to external respiration? No, that's not it. That's a substance. I'm talking about that permeable cellular membrane. That cell membrane that allows for this to happen, that allows respiration to happen. That would be called what in respects to external respiration? You don't have to tell me the name of the membrane if you don't know it, but you can tell me what that membrane would have to be made up of. No. Close, but I need to know more specific about what you put. Specific. specific. I mean, I haven't got any right answers yet. Michaelin, there you go, Michaelin. Excellent. Some more, give me some more choices. What would that permeable cell membrane be made up of that allows respiration in respects to external respiration? Because internal respiration, Michaelin, will be something different, right? But external, that permeable cellular membrane is made up of what? Yeah, that's close, Heather, but I need to know what is that? What exactly is that? What is it? What is that made up of? Stephanie, no. Good choices, guys. Good guesses. This is one of those critical thinking things. What would it have to be made up of? All right, Michaelin, tell us.
Type 1 cells.
Type 1 cells. Type 1 alveolar cells allow for what? Gas diffusion. Type 2 cells produce surfactant. And type 3 cells are macrophages. They eat foreign material. So, if respiration is to occur in the lungs, it has to go across the permeable cellular membrane, which is the type 1 cell. If you didn't have a type 1 cell, it wouldn't be able to diffuse. It couldn't exchange across it. It'd be blocked. Okay? All right, number 3, external respiration is the gas exchange, like we said, between alveoli and the capillaries. Now, we also have what's called internal respiration. Internal respiration is gas exchange between the capillary and the tissues. The capillaries and the tissues have to exchange gas, and that's called internal respiration. Now we're going to get into the type of flow that goes through your vessels, okay? Going through either your fluid vessels or even your airways, okay? In order to determine the type of or the characteristic of the flow through a tube or an airway is called either laminar or turbulent, okay? Laminar or turbulent. What do you think turbulent means?
Rough.
Rough. When an airplane goes through turbulence, it shakes, right? Because you have the air is going in several different directions. You got some going up, some going left, some going right, some going down, some swirling, right? It's become turbulent. So when that airplane gets into that pocket of the different directions of flow, it shakes. Well, same thing happens inside of your vessels or in your airways. In our airways, because the air changes direction a lot, right? It has to go down and it changes to the left and right main stem bronchus and it turns again into the bronchi. When it starts doing all that turning, it starts to become turbulent, okay? Laminar would be smooth. Laminar means smooth, and turbulent means rough. I'll show you a picture of that. This is a diagram of laminar and turbulent flow. And it happens because of resistance, guys. It happens because of resistance. For instance, when you put your thumb over the water hose, you build up resistance inside of the water hose, and it starts to come out faster on the other end. Well, not only is it building up resistance, but the flow of the water starts to become turbulent inside of the water hose. All right. So look at the first one. Laminar is just nice and smooth. The air is going all smoothly in one direction. Turbulent would be when the air swirls around. See those little swirlies? That's when the air is just going in different, swirling around through the airway. And then this is showing you the tracheobronchial look. Some of it, your tracheobronchial tree will have a mixture of laminar and turbulent. And in some areas, they call it mixed. Okay? You have either laminar flow, turbulent flow, or it may be a mixture. All right. Now, how is that determined? The laminar or turbulent flow is determined by something called the Reynolds number. Now, you won't have to know how to come up with the Reynolds number, but you will need to know the basic range. Any flow that is less than 2,000 has a Reynolds number less than 2,000 is considered to be laminar. Any flow that is considered to be has a Reynolds number less than 2,000 is called laminar flow. Any flow that has 2,000 to 4,000 is both laminar and turbulent, so they call it mixed flow. And then any flow that is greater than 4,000 Reynolds number is called turbulent flow. Now, if I was to say Mr. Johnson's PFT showed he had a Reynolds number of 3,000, then what would you say his flow was?
Mixed flow.
Mixed flow. Good. Mixed flow. So that's how that works. All right. B is the lung and thorax relationship. Now, during pulmonary A&P, guys, we talked about the lung and how it sits in the thorax, what the thorax is and how it protects it, the rings, not the rings, but the actual ribs. You have true ribs, floating or false ribs. We talked about the sternum and in parts of the sternum and all of that. But as far as the relationship, the lung and the thorax are opposing forces. They are opposing forces. Now, look at A. The lungs tend to collapse due to elasticity, right? I told you that your lungs are elastic, right? If you didn't have your thorax and I just pulled your lungs out of your chest, they would elastic will close all the way up, right? They would come down real small because they want to collapse. That's what they want to do just because they're elastic. If you had a rubber band in your hand and you were always holding it and you let it go, it's going to collapse. Okay, it wants to collapse, but because you're holding it open, it stays open. Okay, and the thorax, the chest wall wants to spring out. So since the chest wall is wanting to spring out, chest wall wants to do this, and the lungs want to collapse. They are opposing each other, and that keeps the lungs open at all times. That opposing pressure is what keeps the lungs open as you know it today. If the lungs were outside of the thorax, they would completely collapse. But because they're in the thorax and the chest wall is springing out, that pleural pressure keeps it open at all times. That's called opposing force. Two opposing forces. All right. Now, the lungs and the thorax are linked together by the pleura. The pleural that's on the actual lung is called the what?
Visceral.
Parietal.
Visceral. The lining that's actually touching the lung is the visceral pleural. Good. And the pleural that is touching the chest wall is the parietal pleural. All right. Now, in between the two, there's a negative pressure. A negative pressure about -4 to -5 centimeters of water. -4 to -5 centimeters of water. It says potential space between them with a small amount of lubricant, also known as pleural fluid or serous fluid, between those layers. So you got the lung that wants to collapse, the chest wall that wants to spring out, but they're linked together by the pleural, right? And that's like a suction in between there. There's a negative suction, like you want to do a kiss, that generates a negative force. And so the lungs want to collapse, but since the chest wall is sucking the lungs back open because they want to go out, right? So the chest wall wants to come out, the lungs want to collapse, so that chest wall is doing this. Chest wall is sucking the lung to stay open, right? And that is that little pressure in between them, -4 to -5 pleural pressure. That's what keeps them together. The lungs don't collapse and the chest wall don't spring way out because of that joining nature between the two. Now, there are also normal ventilation pressures. When we inspire or when we expire, the change in pressures changes different, because I told you that the basic physics of it is when the lungs become more negative than the ambient pressure, then air has to do what? When the lungs become less or lower than outside, then the air goes which way?
It's going to travel.
In, because gas follows the path of least resistance. So whichever one is lower, that's the way it wants to go, right? Just like when you go to the store and you're looking for some Coke, you better go get a 2 liter of Coke. Now, on one side of the store, the Coke is a 2 liter is $1, and on the other side of the store, the liter is $3. Which way you gonna go? Huh? The cheaper one. You're going to the one that's lower. You're going to be guided to the one that's lower. All right. Same thing with the air does in volume or liquid does in the body. It flows toward the least resistance. So in the lungs, when we inspire, look, the intrapleural pressure becomes -9, and the intrapulmonary pressure becomes about -3. What else happens? The diaphragm contracts and flattens. Chest cavity expands. You have a negative intrapulmonary pressure, a negative trans-airway pressure, so gas has no choice but to flow in through the mouth. See, that's becoming lower than the ambient pressure. When you take that breath, you start to inhale, that diaphragm is contracting and flattening, chest wall is going out and it's doing harder, right? The kiss becomes harder, right? You're sucking that lung open, it becomes more negative. Gas has no choice but to go from ambient into the lungs. So what happens during expiration? Well, in expiration, the intrapleural is about -5, and the intrapulmonary is +3. Positive now, it's positive. So the diaphragm relaxes, right, and ascends back. Chest cavity recoils and decreases inside. It says a slight positive intrapulmonary pressure, and so gas has no choice but to come out of the mouth, because when you exhale, the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the pressure in the ambient surrounding. So gas is going to follow the path of least resistance. So it's going to run away from pressure and come out of the lungs. That is what's happening for your ventilation. It's all about a change in pressure. Write that down. Ventilation is all about a change in pressure. If you don't have a change in pressure, you don't have ventilation. So what do you think the pressure is when in between breaths? What is the pressure gradient? Let's say the pressure gradient in between breaths, between ambient and intrapulmonary. Huh? No. The pressure. What do you think? I just want to know a word for what do you think is happening in between breaths when there's no inhale or no exhale? What must be the case between the ambient pressure and the intrapulmonary pressure? They must be what? Anybody?
It must be the same.
Same. The pressures when in between breaths, the pressure outside and pressure inside is the same. So that's why nothing's moving. Remember I said in order for gas to move, there has to be a change in pressure. When you inhale, you become more negative in your chest than outside, so it goes in. When you exhale, you become more positive than outside, so you go out. But in between breaths, nothing's moving because the pressure is equal. There's an equalization of pressure between ambient and in your lungs, so therefore nothing moves. So don't make it harder than it is, guys. Just stay with it. There's no change in pressure. That's in between breaths, the pressures must be equal. Think about tug of war. Think about tug of war. If one person is pulling on this end and the other one is pulling on this end, right? Well, if I pull more on this side, it's going this way. If I pull more on this side, it's going to go this way, right? But if it's not going either way, it must be pulling the same on both sides. The pressure must be the same. If I'm pulling the same amount on this side than I am on this side, then there's nothing moving. It's going to sit still, okay? It has to be a change in pressure for gas or fluid to move, all right? That's why you have a blood pressure. That's the only way that blood can go through the body is because of change in pressure. All right. So what's happening? Oh, I already said that. Okay. Now, let's look at some physics. Here goes that law. Now, you need to have a separate sheet for the laws. The laws that are told to you or taught to you during RT210 or RT period, all the way through. You need to have one sheet that you write all of your laws on, one sheet that you write all of your formulas on, right? So when you're going back to study, you don't have to try to find, well, I think that formula was in this section, and I think that law was up here in this section. You need to be able to go to it really quick, right? If you're looking for a formula, you know you can go to your formulas page, and all the formulas that you've learned are right there. If you're looking for a law and want to be able to recite what law you're talking about, you should have a sheet that has all the laws that you've learned, right? That way you can go through it very, very quickly, because just think, you got all of this in 210, and you're going to keep this same folder when you go to 220 and start adding to it. By the time you leave, you're going to have a huge binder full of information, okay? Starting from 210 all the way to 250. You don't want to have to be searching through when you're studying. If you're not organized, it's going to be hard to recall this stuff. All right, so here's the first law. The law of Laplace. Law of Laplace. All right, this law, which is P equals 4 ST divided by R, is surface tension tends to collapse alveoli. Same thing I was talking about with the raindrop, right? Laplace is talking about the surface tension of the alveoli. What's happening? When you have a large alveoli and it touches or is collateral ventilating with a smaller alveoli, if this is done without the presence of surfactant, the smaller alveoli will be collapsed, just like the raindrop. But Laplace is not a medical, he was not a medical scientist. His law is the law of physics of the world, like I talk about the raindrop, right? But we're using his law as it pertains to the human body, and it would happen in the human body if not for surfactant. Okay, so surfactant is smacking Laplace in the face. Okay, Laplace says, no, this is going to happen. And then your body says, no, it ain't going to happen because I have surfactant. So the law of Laplace says surface tension tends to collapse alveoli. And that's going to happen if you don't have surfactant or you don't have enough surfactant. Number 2 says surfactant allows what? Different size alveoli to be connected without the smaller one emptying into the larger one and collapsing, like we've said. Surfactant, of course, is a phospholipid, and it decreases surface tension of the alveoli. See, some of this stuff is just review. You already learned some of this stuff, right? It's kind of overlaps. A lot of these lessons will overlap at times, okay? Allows for critical volume to be variable from one alveoli to the other alveoli. Critical volume is the amount of volume that has to be in the alveoli before it collapses. If an alveoli falls below critical volume, it's going to collapse. So if you have a question that says, what is critical volume of an alveoli? That is the volume that must be present in order to keep the alveoli from closing. Critical volume. All right. Compliance. Here goes compliance. Now, have out your, you just learned the law. Now have out your formula sheet, because now you're about to learn a couple of formulas. What is compliance? Compliance of the lung is a change in volume divided by the change in pressure. That's it right there. Compliance equals, that little triangle, guys, means change. Triangle means change. So a change in volume divided by the change in pressure is compliance. Change in volume over change in pressure is compliance. Now, if you notice in your module, I have two whiteboards. I have 2 whiteboards that I took a picture of so I wouldn't have to keep doing them over and over again. Two whiteboards, and they look like, it looks like this, so you'll be able to go back and look at it. Yeah, you're going to look at all of that stuff. But I'm showing you the white page right quick. See how it says whiteboard 1, whiteboard 2? All right, whiteboard 1 is okay. Well, this one's full. This is whiteboard 1, talking about the spirogram. This is the same thing I got on the board, but a different shape. It's just a different shape. It doesn't have the wave. It's just the words. Okay. Spirogram with 4 volumes, 4 capacities, right? Some examples, and these formulas. Minute ventilation formula, alveolar minute ventilation formula, dead space What is it to find dead space? How do I find the tidal volume if I don't know? And oh, here goes compliance. Change in volume over change in pressure. And then the 4 types of dead space: anatomical, alveolar, physiologic, and mechanical. You're going to learn those when we get to them. I'm just showing you the board. You can go back and look to get your information that you might need, okay? That's the first one. Let me see what's on the second. That was whiteboard 1. And whiteboard 2. All right. And this was the one I was just showing you the actual, like you got on the board now. Now this has a little bit more information because it tells you how much is in each one. Okay. How much is in each one. For instance, inspiratory reserve volume is 3.1 liters. You got to know what it is, how to define it, and how much is it. You're going to have to know that. When you do oral questions, they're going to say, define inspiratory capacity. And you're going to have, and that's this right here. When you learn it, you will have to have said inspiratory capacity is the gas that is moved after all that you can inhale and all that you can exhale forcefully. And that amount is 3.6 liters. Or it is tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. These two here equal all of this. All right? That's how you got to learn that spirogram. You must learn it 100% in order to really understand it, right? Because you're going to be using this a lot. Here goes compliance again. Change in volume over change in pressure. All right. Okay. Go back to the lesson plan. So compliance. You got a couple of different types of compliance. Now it says total compliance is the lung and thorax. The lung is not measured outside of thorax, of course. Pulmonary compliance is about 0.2 liters per centimeter of water. Thoracic compliance is about 0.2 liters per centimeter of water, and total compliance is about 0.1 liters per centimeter of water. Now, you don't have to remember this part, but I do want you to remember this one, which is compliance. You need to remember dynamic compliance. You need to remember static compliance. Okay? We're talking about the ability of the lungs to do what they do, right? That's compliance. And the way to get it, to find out what a patient's compliance is, we put this formula in action. They're changing, if they're on the ventilator and their volume changes all of a sudden and the pressure changes, well, then we can do the math to find out what their compliance is at that moment. Okay? Because let's say you're on a ventilator and I'm giving you 500 milliliters of air, right? But then your compliance goes down. That means the lungs get stiffer, right? Well, then now the pressure that I was taking to give you that 500 now is going to take more pressure to give you that 500 because your lungs are becoming less compliant. Okay? They're becoming less compliant. And so that's how we look at that on the ventilator in order to find out what their compliance is. Now I'm going to give you the normals to compliance. So you got the compliance formula right there. Change in volume over change in pressure. All right. Normal compliance is 60 to 100 milliliters per centimeter of water. Centimeters of water.
Can you repeat that again?
60 to 100. 60 to 100 milliliters per centimeter of water. That is the normal compliance, or just regular compliance. right, that's the normal compliance. Regular compliance, my black marker kind of acting up. 60 to 100. Compliance is changing volume over change in pressure. The normal compliance is 60 to 100 milliliters per centimeter of water. That's the normal value for compliance, the regular compliance. Now we're going to talk about dynamic compliance. Dynamic compliance is a little bit different, okay? It is corrected volume over the peak pressure. So the volume over the peak pressure, all right? This is static. Static or dynamic? Dynamic, okay? So dynamic is CLDYN, right? Compliance dynamic is volume over peak pressure. The peak pressure is the pressure that is taken for me to give you that volume. All right. When I put some volume into one of y'all, I'm gonna get a pressure back. How much pressure did it take for me to give it to Laura? Right. But if I put that same pressure in Kelsey, it's gonna be a different pressure back. Okay. And it's mainly because of height. Okay. The lungs are anatomically based on height mostly. All right. The taller the lung, the longer the lung, the more volume it's going to have, okay? You can be 500 pounds, but if you're only 4'1" and 500 pounds, you will have less volume in your lungs than someone who is 100 pounds but 7 feet tall. It's all about length. Hold on one second. Hello? Yes. Oh, okay, yeah, I'm teaching class right now. I have to call you back. All right, thank you. Okay. All right.
CL what?
That's DYN, dynamic. Dynamic compliance is volume over peak pressure. That normal is 30 to 40 milliliters per centimeter of water. 30 to 40 ml per centimeter of water. And then the last one is static compliance. CL stat is volume over plateau. Plateau pressure. Who knows what a plateau is?
Like when you
Where it levels off.
bottom out or flatten out.
And it flattens out. So our breathing is like this. Your breathing is in, out, in, out, in, out, right? That's our normal breathing. But if I want to know the patient's plateau pressure, then I have to do what's called an inspiratory pause. Okay, that will be on the ventilator. They will have to be on the ventilator to push the inspiratory pause button. So what's going to happen is it's going to inspire and then pause and then go back. This is the plateau. This will be the plateau pressure because that's where the breath was held. I can read that pressure because we want to know what is the pressure in the lungs at all times. Are the lungs becoming more compliant or are they becoming less compliant? And I can do one of these maneuvers called an inspiratory hold and find out the plateau pressure. So then what I do is take that plateau pressure and divide it by the volume that I'm giving them, and that's going to give me their static compliance. Static means no movement, right? Static means still. So when they inhale and pause, the pressure in the lungs during that pause is static compliance. And that is 40 to 60. ml per centimeter of water. These are your compliance formulas and their normals.
Mr. McCarthy, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find the peak pressure? If the plateau, they hold their breath, how did you find the peak pressure for the dynamic?
Peak pressure is going to be a value that's on your machine. It tells you how much pressure is it taking to push each breath in them.
Oh, okay.
So that's something you'll see on your ventilator. It's going to, when I give you that 500 or that 600, whatever volume I'm giving with each breath, it's going to tell me how much back pressure it took to get that to you. So for instance, if you are breathing through a water hose, or let's just say this, if I blow some volume through this, right? Okay. The pressure that it took to put that in is going to be pretty low because it's pretty wide, right? But what if I was doing that same amount of air or the same amount of volume into a coffee straw, right? It's going to take me more pressure to get that in there, right? Because that's smaller. So you can think of a coffee straw as a lung that has a very low compliance. It's tight, it's rigid, and I have to blow hard to get it in there, right? Or think of balloons. You got some balloons that are easy to blow up and some of them cheap balloons that you have to have a vein pop in your head in order to blow it up, right? That same breath that you're doing, it's the same breath, but it's taking a lot more pressure to accomplish blowing up the balloon. Same thing with your lungs. If your lungs have a very low compliance, it's going to take more pressure to get it in there, okay? So when I'm blowing it in there, I'm reading, the machine is going to tell me how much pressure did that take to deliver that breath? How much pressure did it take to deliver that breath? It's going to give you a number with every breath, okay? And so you have to look at your machine to fill this stuff out. If I'm giving 500 volume and the peak pressure is 25, and I do 500 divided by 25, and that would be my dynamic compliance. And then knowing my normals, I'll know if either it's normal or it's not. Okay? So for instance, let's do this one. Mr. Johnson was on your ventilator, okay? And we were delivering him Yes. Yeah, same machine. Ventilator, life support, respirator, all that's the same machine. When they can't ventilate, you have to ventilate for them. Yep. All right. So Mr. Johnson is on the ventilator, okay? Or let's just say Mr. Smith. He's on the vent. And these are my parameters. All right, his tidal volume that we're given. Tidal volume that we're given is 625 mLs. All right, his peak inspiratory pressure. So his peak PIP, guys, is peak pressure. PEAK, that's the amount that it takes at the peak. That's P, we're written as PIP. This is peak inspiratory pressure. Peak inspiratory pressure. Okay, so that's the peak pressure right there. He has a peak.
Was that, Mr. McCarthy, is that 625 milliliters or 6.25?
625. 625. He has a peak inspiratory pressure of 55 centimeters of water. A plateau pressure of 18 on water. Okay? Now, I want to know, what is his dynamic compliance? Put it in the chat. Don't say it out loud. Put it in the chat. What is his dynamic compliance? I want to know his CLDYN. Put it in the chat. Tell me his dynamic compliance with these parameters. It should be on your screen. What is his dynamic compliance? I haven't worked it out, so let me sit down and work it out. I got one answer. Let me see. See what I got. Okay, good, Kelsey. Courtney, good. Yeah, look at it again, Michael, and I think you might have. Charisma, good. There you go, Michael, and look at it again, iPhone. Kelsey, Courtney, Michael, and Charisma, Lori. All right. Dynamic compliance equals volume 625 divided by peak pressure of 55 gave me a answer of about 11.4. 11.4 milliliters per centimeter of water.
Does the 0.4 and all that matter?
Not really. I mean,
Okay.
it depends on your answer choices. If it go that deep in the answer, then pick the best one. What you say, Ray? Huh? What 18? That's not what you needed for that problem. You only pick out what you need for the problem. I asked you what the dynamic compliance is. Dynamic compliance is volume over peak pressure. 18 is his plateau pressure. So you don't need that. Okay, you're gonna have a lot of problems that's got a lot of information. You just need to pick out what the person's asking for. Okay. All right. Now, what about this one? Same patient. What is his plateau pressure? What is his CL plat? So here's, let me see. Good, Kelsey, Lori, Charisma, that's cool. Courtney, okay. iPhone, good. Your last name William? Say William? William Kenya, right? All right, Talisha, good. All right, so it should be about 34.7 or 35 milliliters per centimeter of water. So it should say 35 mL per centimeter of water. Now, is his static compliance normal?
Yes.
No.
No, it's low. My bad.
Low. So that's how we can start judging things that are changing. Is it his compliance? So his compliance, that if I looked at that, I would say this guy's compliance is dropping. And what you would do is you would keep getting these snapshots. Look at some, and then maybe an hour later, look at it again. Hour later, look at it again, right? So right now, his static compliance is 35 at that time, right? So let's just say this was at 8 a.m. At 8 a.m., you got these values on him, okay? At 8 a.m., that's what you got. Now, let's say at 10 o'clock, we came back. 10 a.m., his tidal volume is still 625, and that's what he's on the vent. 625. His peak inspiratory pressure is now 60. And his plateau pressure is now 32 centimeters of water. Now, what I want you to do is to tell me what now is his static compliance, and is his compliance getting higher or lower? What is his static compliance now, and is it getting higher or lower than the last one? The last one was 8 a.m. Yeah, it was 35. That was the CL stat. At 8 a.m., it was 35. At 10 a.m., you're going to tell me what it is now. And is it getting worse? Or, because it could be worse either way, but is it dropping or increasing? Just because it's getting low, don't mean it's getting, either way, it could be worse. It can be worse when it gets real high or worse when it gets real low. Either one, okay? Don't be so now, oh, his compliance dropping, that's worse. No, don't look at it like that. Either way, too much is bad.
After we figure out how much it is, figure out what then?
Is his compliance dropping or increasing? I just want to know his plateau. I mean his static compliance. All right. So I got a couple of some people, a lot of people saying 19.5 and decreasing. Looks good to me. I haven't worked it out, but everybody getting the same answer. So it started at 35, now it's 19, right? So his compliance is dropping. Okay, so then when I see that it's dropping, we'll start looking for causes for compliance to drop. That's when when I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with you, I need to know where at least to start, right? So I'll get this compliance going and say, oh, well, he's got a low compliance. That gives me a whole avenue to go down to figure out what's causing this low compliance. Okay, could it be some type of restrictive disease? Remember I said restrictive means you can't get the air out, right? Obstructive, you can't get, obstructive, you can't get the air out. Restrictive, you can't get the air in. And I said that obstructive patients have a high compliance, right? And so that will be looking for the obstructive diseases. But if the compliance is getting low, now I need to be looking for the restrictive diseases that are causing the compliance to drop, okay? That gives me an avenue of where I want to go, okay? So his compliance is dropping. I'm gonna start thinking about pulmonary edema, right? Some type of interstitial lung disease. Does he have scoliosis? Things like that, okay, that are restricting him, all right? Now, last thing I'm gonna do, we're gonna move on. We're gonna take a break and then we're gonna move on. This is the normal compliance here, guys. This is just regular compliance, 60 to 100. Learning what you've learned, I want you to answer this question. Mr. Smith has a compliance of 180 milliliters per centimeter of water. Does he have an obstruction or restriction? He has a compliance of 180 milliliters per centimeter of water. I want to know, does Mr. Smith have an obstruction or does he have a restriction? Put it in the chat and then we're going to take a break. Using what you've learned so far today about this very thing I'm talking about. Good, Kelsey. Good, Courtney. Excellent. Good, Ms. Williams. Oh, so it's 2 iPhones. That's why I said iPhone. I don't know who else. I don't know if it's Stephanie or somebody. I don't know. Michael, and look at it again.
It's me, Mr. McCarthy, Sydney.
Oh, Sydney. That's right, Sydney. All right. Yasmin, good. Charisma, good. Sydney, good. Stephanie, good. There you go, Michael. Michael, you said construction. I don't know what that is.
My bad, I meant obstruction.
All right, it's an obstructive disease, guys. It's an obstructive because I told you earlier, compliance, right, and obstruction, or COPD. COPD and compliance, we talked about, they go hand in hand. They're directly related, right? So if I have an obstructive disease, then I'm going to have a high compliance. If I have obstruction disease, I have a high compliance. If I have an obstruction, I have a high compliance. They go hand in hand. Okay? Anybody else remember what I said about that earlier? Did you write that down? What I told you to write down earlier about what goes in that are directly related. What did I tell you that were directly related earlier? FRC. Okay, good. Okay, good. Because I was like, damn, what did I say? All right. So the same thing. If Mr. Smith has 180 milliliters per centimeter of water compliance, does he have a high FRC or a lower FRC? A high, because high FRC and compliance go hand in hand. So if his compliance is up, his FRC is going to be high. Okay, so that's how you have to be able to say that. Well, I'm looking at that 180, that means he has a high FRC because they go hand in hand. Okay, take a break. It's 3 o'clock. Well, it's 3:05. Come back at 3:15. Take a break to 3:15, and we're going to continue on. Regular compliance. We talked about dynamic compliance. We talked about static compliance. Did a few problems to understand those. I gave you the actual normal values for those. Now we got to figure out what are some things that cause these problems. Well, we know that COPD causes an increase in compliance, but let's look at some of the things that cause a decreased compliance. And before we do that, make sure you write this down and for your notes so that you're able to compare and contrast the words. For instance, COPD patients, which are obstructive diseases. COPD is made up of 5 obstructive diseases. If you have 2 or more of those, you consider to have COPD. Okay, we'll talk about those a little later. But you got COPD or an obstruction. Okay, then you have a increase in FRC. They also have an increased compliance, and they have a decreased elastance. Elastance is the ability to come back, right? If you have, so think about the rubber band. A regular rubber band as compared to the rubber band from the grocery store that's on the broccoli. Okay, does anybody know that rubber band that comes on the broccoli? Real thick and real tight. Okay, that has a very high elastance. Okay, if I go buy a brand new pair of drawers, they're going to have a high elastance. But if you pull out some underwear from the drawer that's been there for 15 years, it's going to have lost its elasticity. It's going to have a low elastance. Okay, so elastance is, that's what I was. Elastance is elastance is inversely related to what? Now I'm just looking for one of these terms. Compliance. Compliance. Elastance is inversely related to compliance, because if I have a high compliance, I'm going to have a low elastance. If I have a high elastance, that means I have a low compliance. And here, you need to mute your mic. All right, there we go. Yeah. All right. Okay, here we go. Elastance is inversely related to compliance. Right here. High compliance, low elastance. Low compliance, high elastance. These are the same. So I can make the statement high FRC, low elastance. Right? Low FRC, high elastance. High elastance, restrictive issue. Low elastance, obstructive issue. See that? Make sure you write that down, all this down, so that you can be comparing, because these equal. This is equal, this is equal. So if these two are true, then elastance is inversely related to compliance, and you can say all kinds of stuff. Okay? I can say a high FRC is directly related to compliance. All right? We already said that. So you have to be able to distinguish these, guys. You have to be able to distinguish between what, okay? Don't get elastance and compliance confused. They are opposites, okay? Elastance is the ability to snap back. But if somebody has a high compliance, they can't snap back, all right? It's floppy. They have floppy lungs, not tight lungs, all right? So make sure you write that down and go over it so that you can understand the dynamic of that. All right, you need to be able to master that thought process. Okay, have to be able to master that thought process in order, because you're gonna fill this up with diseases. I'm not gonna just say COPD. I may say emphysema, which is one of the COPD diseases. You gotta know, okay, it's one of the COPD diseases, so therefore this is true. I might say pulmonary edema. Well, pulmonary edema is a restrictive disease, so this would be true for pulmonary edema, if I got a patient with pulmonary edema. All right? All right, so let's look at the notes. Continue on with the notes, where it talks about what's going to be seen in a low compliance. Decreased or less compliance is usually seen in, and this says increased work of breathing right here, guys. If somebody has a low compliance, they're going to have an increased work of breathing. Work of breathing. Because the lungs are tight. If your lungs are tight, then you're going to be working hard to breathe, right? It's going to be hard to breathe if your lungs are super tight. And that happens with pulmonary consolidation, which means there are some secretions or some mucus that's filling up one of those segments or one or two segments in the lungs. So if the segment is full of mucus, then it can't be full of air. All right, one thing can occupy the space. So if it's full of mucus and consolidation, it won't open like you want it to. So therefore, it's a restriction and has a low compliance. It won't do what you want it to do, means it has low compliance. If your child won't follow directions, that child has low compliance. If somebody won't take their medicine like they're supposed to, they have a low compliance. Okay? Pulmonary edema, that's when fluid is all in the lungs. If fluid is all in the lungs, guys, then air can't be there too. So if the fluid is taking up the space, then the lungs will not do what you want them to do. Therefore, they are less compliant. A pneumothorax. A pneumothorax is a hole in the lung. Make sure you write that down. A pneumothorax is a hole in the lung. If I have a hole in my lung, then it's not going to fill up with air and all of that, because it's going to go, the air is going to go right out the hole. It's just going to stay there. It's like a hole in a balloon. Can you blow up a balloon if it's a big hole in it? No. So if it won't blow up, it's less compliant. Okay? It won't do what you want it to do. Therefore, it's not compliant or less compliant. What about abdominal distension? What if somebody has a 700 pounds and their stomach is on their diaphragm, and the diaphragm cannot retract because the stomach is so large, or the patient is pregnant, right? 9 months pregnant. So the diaphragm is not able to descend. And since it can't descend, the lungs can't fill. Therefore, they're less compliant. Simple as that. If they won't do what you want them to do, then they're compliant. I mean, if they won't do what you want them to do, they have a low compliance. Okay? Pulmonary I'll just say pulmonary fibrosis is kind of like scarring of the lungs and hardening. When the lungs become scarred and hard, called fibrotic. They have fibroids that are on the lungs. They become hard and they can't stretch like you want them to do. Therefore, they have a low compliance. ARDS is acute respiratory distress syndrome. That's what's happening with the COVID patients. COVID patients' lungs are being overwhelmed by pneumonia, COVID pneumonia, and it is scarring and tearing up the lungs, and they go into ARDS. Acute respiratory distress syndrome. Acute respiratory distress syndrome. Lungs won't do what you want them to do, so therefore they are less compliant. And then finally, thoracic deformities. If you're deformed, the lungs can't do what you want them to do, therefore they are less compliant. All right? It may be one. Yes, I'm not finished. All right, thoracic deformity. So if you have somebody who, and those which would be scoliosis, which the scoliosis is when the spine is like this, right? I'm not a drawer, but if somebody's back looks like that and their spine is curved like that, that's scoliosis. If it's curved like that and they're walking around like that, guys, their lungs can't expand like they're supposed to. Therefore, that's a low compliant lung. Okay? It's the skeletal problem is restricting the lung from opening. Okay? Restrictive means you can't get the air in. And there's reasons. You're going to learn type of restrictions that happen, but that's later. So not only that, thoracic deformity, but there's also something called Pectus Excavatum. Is when the chest looks like it's been dug out with an excavator, right? It's sunk in, right? Or Pectus carinatum is known as pigeon chest, where the chest pokes out in a point. It's locked in on the side and out in a point like that. They're born with those deformities. Thoracic deformities. That means the thoracic cage is restricting the lung from inflating like they should. Therefore, that's a low compliant lung. All right. And then, of course, complete airway obstruction. That would be something that cause your airways to completely close up. Okay. They completely closed up. All of your airways are completely closed. Therefore, the lungs are not going to ventilate. So that's a low compliant lung. Now, what about compliance increasing? If somebody has a high compliance, right? Now we're getting into our obstructive diseases. If you look to the right here, these are a list of the CBABE diseases. If you have, these are the COPD diseases called CBABE. And they're, because there's cystic fibrosis, B for bronchitis, A for asthma, another B for bronchiectasis, and the last E for emphysema. These are the CBABE diseases. If you have these, you are considered to have COPD. What? Worker breathing? Worker breathing. Yeah, worker breathing. Mhm. So your COPD diseases, if you have 2 or more of these, you're considered to have COPD. Just because you got asthma doesn't necessarily mean you have COPD, or just because you got bronchitis doesn't mean you have, but if you got bronchitis and asthma, or you have cystic fibrosis and bronchiectasis, or you may have asthma and emphysema, you have COPD. Once you get to COPD status, it's irreversible. You might can reverse some of the symptoms, but the damage is done. You have to memorize these CBABE diseases. So what you got to tell yourself is that you got COPD, baby, right? You got COPD, baby, and you know that's the CBABE diseases. All right? CBABE diseases. The obstructive diseases that I pointed out on the board where I said COPD equals a high FRC, equals a high compliance, equals a low elastance. Well, I can put any one of these in place of COPD. You need to know what happens, right? If I say if I asked you, what type of elastance does a cystic fibrosis patient have?
Obstructive.
It'd be a low.
Listen, yeah. I said, what type of elastance would a cystic fibrosis patient have?
Low.
Low elastance. I said, what type of elastance would a cystic fibrosis patient have? And you know that cystic fibrosis is one of the COPD diseases. So if it is, it has a low elastance. 2 or more. Yeah. All right. What about bronchiectasis? If somebody has bronchiectasis, then I could say they probably have what type of FRC? A high FRC, because any COPD disease has a high FRC. Okay, you getting this, Ms. Williams? Anything that COPD has a high FRC, a high compliance, and a low elastance. These CBABE diseases are all COPD. So any one of these COPD diseases will have a high FRC, a high compliance, and a low elastance. Okay, so if I say emphysema, the patient has emphysema, what type of compliance would a patient with emphysema have? A high compliance. That's all I'm doing. All right. So compliance, and look at number 6. Compliance increases. Alveolar distension. This is when the alveoli are starting to over distend and they're becoming floppy. When you overwork them and they over distend, then they're kind of got stretch marks, right? It's like stretch marks on the alveoli. Alveolar septal defects. Right? So the wall between the alveoli may be a defect there. Those will cause compliance to increase. But the major thing that causes this is COPD. Okay? COPD, which are the CBABE diseases, obstructive disorders. So alveolar distension, alveolar septal defect, and COPD all cause the compliance to increase. So it's not just COPD. Somebody could have alveolar distension or alveolar septal defect. Can also cause them to have a high compliance. So that's what they try to show you a little example here. So if somebody learning what you've learned, if somebody has emphysema, then they have a high FRC. We've already talked about number 7, but you can write it down. Compliance is inversely related to who? Elastance. Compliance is inversely related to elastance. Inverse means opposite. And what is elastance? Elastance is the property of resisting deformation, right? It won't let you open it and just leave it just kind of cocked to the side, right? It's gonna come back to its form. That's the elastance property. It's gonna come back. If you had a rubber band and you stretch it out, once you let go, it's gonna come back to its original form because it has elastance, right? But over time, if you wear out that elastance, then when you do open it up or deform it or change the shape, it's just gonna stay that way, right? It's gonna stay that way. Now we're going to get into resistance. Resistance, which is in liters per second. That's when we talked about the flow going through your airway, right? When it starts hitting the wall, or if the flow is going faster, the more resistance it builds up. The faster you push flow through a tube, the more resistance is going to build up because the more turbulent it's going to become. Okay, the faster the air moves through the airway, the more turbulent it becomes, thus increasing the resistance. Okay, and this is the formula, so put that on your formulas page. This is the formula for resistance. Resistance is written as RAW, R-A-W. RAW, R-A-W, equals R-A-W, which is resistance, equals the peak inspiratory pressure, or the peak pressure, minus the plaque pressure divided by the flow that's going through in liters per second. You need to also know that an increase in resistance equals an increase in work of breathing. Let me make it bigger for you. An increase in resistance equals an increase in work of breathing. If I got more resistance in my airway, it's going to be harder for me to get that flow. It's going to be harder for me to breathe. The higher the resistance is. Okay, the higher the resistance. And you're going to find out about old Poisson coming up. What he says about resistance. This is the formula that you should have on your formulas page. This is the formula for resistance. What is the normal value for resistance? Should be 0.5 to 2.5 liters per second. That is the normal resistance. Anything higher than this is a high resistance. Now they're going to start having some shortness of breath because that work of breathing has increased. Huh? Yes, that's the normal resistance. Normal resistance. Now, this is where we're going to get into where this and a straw come into play. Breathing through this or breathing through a straw? Which one you think you rather use? This or a straw? This, right? Okay, well, that's what Poisson said. All right, that's what Poisson said you ought to want to do. All right, here is his formula. Now, talking about laminar, of course, they just go back and say it. Poisson's law states that flow rate varies directly with the radius of the tube. Small changes in airway radius will dramatically affect the flow and resistance. Okay? Yes. You don't have it, Patty. I don't know why. Let me see. Just write down what you see, and we'll try to find it in a minute. All right. Poisson. His name is Poisson. Okay, French physicist that came up with this law here. Poisson. Okay, he says that the flow rate varies directly with the rate of the tube. The smaller the tube, the higher the flow. Okay, when you put your thumb over halfway over a water hose, the flow of water does what? Increase or decrease? Increase. When I'm watering the plants and I don't have one of those sprayers and I just have my thumb, if I put my thumb over half of the radius of the hose, it's going to build up a great resistance inside and shoot the water out much faster, right? Well, that's what Poisson is saying. If you close your airway down, then the resistance is going to build up, right? And the work of breathing is going to go up, all right? Now, why does it do that? Here it is right here. This is what you need to know. This is his formula, or his law, I'm sorry. This is his law. If you decrease the diameter by 1/2, you will increase the resistance by 16 times. I guarantee you will see that several times, and that will be a question on your exam. That will be a question on your oral exam, your question on your final. It'll be everywhere. If you decrease the diameter by 1/2, then you will increase the resistance by 16 times. If you decrease the diameter by 1/2, then you will increase the resistance by 16 times. This is what he's saying. Everybody look at the screen. This is the diameter, right? The diameter of this airway. If I cover it up half, right? If I cover half of that diameter up, the resistance inside of this tube will increase by how many times? 16 times. Good. Somebody's gonna miss that though. I'm telling you. Make sure you write that down. That is whose law?
Poison's.
Poisson. And then the other law that you learned today was whose law? Who's the other law that you learned today?
Laplace.
Laplace. And he talks about the surface tension of the alveoli, right? Laplace talks about surface tension of the alveoli, and Poisson talks about the resistance in the airway. Decrease that diameter by 1/2, and you're going to increase the resistance by 16 times, which will increase your work of breathing. Right? All right. Huh? Yeah, I'm coming back to it. All right. All right, now, and that was with laminar. They was talking about laminar surface. Now let's look at turbulent. Turbulent. Now, another word for turbulent, guys, is eddy flow. Eddy. Remember, you have laminar and you have turbulent. And we talked about the Reynolds number is what determines whether the flow is laminar or turbulent. I gave you the numbers in which to know whether that flow or that Reynolds number means laminar or turbulent. Now, turbulent may also be written as eddy flow. All right, so if you see eddy flow, they're talking about turbulent. All right, and all they're saying is the higher the flow rate, the more resistance. The harder you breathe, the more resistance you're building up inside your airway. All right, resistance is also directly proportional to gas density. You don't have to worry about that part. There's not really much that we can do with that part. All right, mute your mic. Whoever's just came in, mute your mic. Now, the tracheobronchial tree that I showed you on the PowerPoint, it has both laminar and turbulent, right? Because of the directional changes in the conductive airways. Your tracheobronchial tree turns corners 100 times, right? And so as that flow changes direction, it can go from smooth to rough because of that change, right? It can become from laminar to turbulent, or also known as eddy flow. All right? All right. Now, the trach, like I said, tracheobronchial has three parts. I mean, trach has both laminar and turbulent is caused by the directional changes in the conductive airway. Now, tomorrow we will be getting into this right here, lung volumes. So what I need you to do is make sure you look at there's a PowerPoint that is in the module that says lung volumes, okay? It says lung volume. Let me show you where it is. In the module, lung volumes PowerPoint. It's right here. Click it and study it so that you're prepared tomorrow to answer some questions, because it's a lot of information, but it's not like in amount, but it's a lot to process. And the more time you have to look at it, the better you'll be. So lung volumes, you want to see about the 4 capacities and the 4 volumes. It talks about the 4 volumes, and then it's going to tell you what each one is, how much it is, right? Got the spirogram, and it lets you, these are the definition. IRV, inspiratory reserve volume, is the maximum inhalation following a quiet inhalation. So what that means is after you breathe in normal, you suck in more air, then that amount is called the IRV, right? You have to know how to define these volumes and capacities. It shows you how much it is, which is 3.1 liters, and it shows you, you can look at it right here, IRV. After the normal in, you go in some more. That is, this from here to here is your IRV, okay? So look at this PowerPoint tonight. All right, look at this PowerPoint tonight is what you need to look, and then I'm gonna tell you what your homework is. Homework for tonight is for homework tonight, do homework number 1 and 2. Homework number 1 and 2 from RT210. What is this? C or D? D. RT210, D as in dog. Homework number 1 and 2. is homework tonight. I'm about to put it in here now, and you can submit it by midnight for your attendance for today. Be sure to go back and study everything we just learned, because don't forget, going forward, pop quizzes are in effect. So you could possibly have a pop quiz on this tomorrow morning for a grade. So be sure that you study. Don't play any games with this. All right? Do homework number 1 and 2, and tomorrow we're going to go into lung volumes. Talk about the lung volumes. It's not a whole lot, but it's a lot left. Not a whole lot, but you got a nice amount. So we won't start volumes today. We'll start volumes fresh at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Okay, only had 2 people that came to the class. So, you know, like I said, if you want to come, just come. I forgot whose day it even is. Whose day was it supposed to be for the day? I forgot. So we'll just start over. It's open for it's open for alpha students tomorrow. Let's just say that, because I don't know which one was last, but it ain't like we had the people knocking the door down to get in here. So it's open for alpha students tomorrow. Okay. Online live classroom lecture is open to alpha students tomorrow if you want to come. However, if you're an omega student and you want to come, just let me know. You should have no problem with getting space, because nobody's really coming. And I fear that once you get to the end, you get to I and J, then everybody gonna want to start coming and wonder what I got to do to pass, and it's gonna be too little, too late. So take it serious. That's the end of that. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and when it gets too low, and I'll put today's lecture in there for what the amount that I did record, and your homework lesson I'll put in there, and I'll see you tomorrow.